At her sister-in-law's luxury engagement, they called her a housekeeper. His mother said, "You are staff here." Her husband chuckled, "She only brings food for the family." But she stood tall, slid off her ring and declared, "Here I am, yours no more." His smile vanished. This was only the beginning. "Hi, my beautiful family. Today I raise my heart in prayer for you. May the Almighty bless every home with peace, every heart with love, and every step with success. May He give health to those who are weak, strength to those who feel tired, and comfort to every soul that is hurting. I pray your families are surrounded with unity and joy, your children shine like stars, and your days are filled with endless blessings. May your nights be calm, your mornings bright, and your future greater than your dreams. Never forget, my beautiful family, you are my greatest treasure. Your happiness is my prayer, and your love is my strength. If your heart is with me, right, present. If your love is true, right, I am with Mr. Peter." The moment Michelle Anna stepped into that glittering ballroom, she should have known they were setting her up for the kill. Diamonds sparkled like frozen tears under the magnificent chandelier, and the air was thick with expensive perfume and whispered gossip. The Handy family's grand estate had been transformed into a fairy tale setting for Victoria's engagement party, but Michelle felt like the villain in someone else's story. She carried the silver serving tray with practiced grace, her elegant black dress making her look more like a sophisticated guest than the woman they were about to destroy. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had personally selected every detail of this party's decor. The white roses cascading from crystal vases, the gold-rimmed champagne flutes, the string quartet playing softly in the corner, all of it had been her vision, her taste, her careful orchestration. Yet here she was, relegated to serving the very guests she had invited, carrying hors d'oeuvres she had personally taste-tested with the caterer just days before. Michelle had dressed carefully for tonight, choosing the black Valentino gown Todd had bought her for their anniversary, back when he still pretended their marriage mattered to him. She'd spent extra time on her makeup, wanting to look perfect for Victoria's special night. She'd even worn the pearl necklace that had belonged to Todd's grandmother, a family heirloom Margaret had grudgingly allowed her to borrow for special occasions. Every choice had been made with love, with hope that tonight might be different, that tonight she might finally be treated like family instead of staff. But as she moved through the crowd of distinguished guests, Michelle could feel the familiar weight of invisible chains. The other women wore their jewels and designer gowns like armor, but Michelle's beautiful dress felt more like a costume, something she'd put on to play a role that was slowly killing her soul. She recognized most of the faces in the room. These were people she'd entertained in her own home, whose charity galas she'd attended, whose children she'd tutored through her foundation work. Yet tonight, with a serving tray in her hands, she might as well have been invisible. The same people who had praised her intelligence and grace at other gatherings now looked through her as if she were just another piece of hired help. "Darling, who is that beautiful woman serving the appetizers?" Mrs. Wellington, the bride-to-be's mother, whispered to her husband as Michelle glided past their table. "She's absolutely stunning." The question hung in the air like a loaded gun, waiting for someone to pull the trigger. Mrs. Wellington's voice carried the refined accent of old money, the kind of breeding that the Handy family desperately wanted to be associated with. Michelle had heard Margaret practicing that same intonation in private, trying to erase the traces of her middle-class upbringing that occasionally slipped through her carefully constructed facade. Todd's mother, Margaret Handy, overheard, and her lips curved into a smile that could cut glass. This was her moment, the opportunity she had been waiting for. "Oh, that's just our housekeeper," she announced loudly enough for half the room to hear. "She insists on helping with these events. You know how the help can be, always trying to feel important." The words sliced through Michelle like a physical blade. She had known this family for years, had shared intimate family dinners, had been present for their private celebrations and crises. She had listened to Margaret's complaints about her friends, had offered comfort during the older woman's health scares, had even helped plan Margaret's own birthday celebration just months before. Yet here Margaret was, reducing her to nothing more than hired help in front of the very people whose respect the Handy family craved most. "Darling, who is that beautiful woman serving the appetizers?" Mrs. Wellington, the bride-to-be's mother, whispered to her husband as Michelle glided past their table. "She's absolutely stunning." The question hung in the air like a loaded gun, waiting for someone to pull the trigger. Todd's mother, Margaret Handy, overheard, and her lips curved into a smile that could cut glass. This was her moment, the opportunity she had been waiting for. "Oh, that's just our housekeeper," she announced loudly enough for half the room to hear. "She insists on helping with these events. You know how the help can be, always trying to feel important." Michelle's hand tightened on the tray, but she kept moving, her spine straight and her head high. She had survived worse humiliations than this, or so she thought. A housekeeper? Mrs. Wellington's voice carried across the room with surprise. "But she's so elegant, so refined. Are you quite sure?" Margaret's laugh was like shattering glass. "Oh yes, quite sure. She's very good at pretending, though. I'll give her that much credit." The words hit Michelle like physical blows, but she continued serving, her smile never wavering. She had learned long ago that showing weakness in this house was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. "Michelle." Todd's voice boomed across the room, calling her like one would summon a servant. "Come here." "Sweetheart, Mrs. Wellington was asking about you." The endearment dripped with condescension as Michelle approached the head table where her husband sat with his family and their distinguished guests. Todd looked handsome in his tailored tuxedo, his smile bright and charming, but Michelle could see the cruel glint in his eyes that others missed. "Mrs. Wellington, I'd like you to meet my wife, Michelle," Todd said. The word wife, barely audible as he emphasized it with a mocking tone. Though, as Mother mentioned, she does insist on playing housekeeper at our family gatherings. Michelle felt the blood drain from her face. Her own husband, the man who had promised to love and cherish her, was publicly reducing her to hired help at his sister's engagement party. "Your wife?" Mrs. Wellington looked confused, glancing between Michelle and Margaret Handy. "But I thought you said she was—" "Oh, she is whatever we need her to be," Margaret interrupted smoothly, her eyes never leaving Michelle's face. "Aren't you, dear? Your staff here tonight, just like any other evening?" The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Michelle could feel dozens of eyes on her, could hear the whispers starting to spread like wildfire. The other guests were beginning to realize they were witnessing something terrible, but no one moved to stop it. "That's right," Todd added with a chuckle that made Michelle's soul shrivel. "She only brings food for the family anyway. Don't you, Michelle? That's about all you're good for around here." The serving tray slipped from Michelle's numb fingers, crashing to the marble floor with a sound like thunder. Crystal glasses shattered, sending champagne and canapes across the pristine white marble. The entire ballroom fell silent, except for the tinkling of broken glass. Victoria, the bride-to-be, looked mortified. "Todd, what are you doing? She's your wife, not a servant. Wife?" Todd's laugh was ugly now, all pretense of charm gone. "She's whatever I say she is. And tonight she's the help. Isn't that right, Mother?" Margaret nodded approvingly. "Exactly right, son. Some people need to remember their place in this family." Michelle stood in the ruins of broken crystal and spilled champagne, her elegant dress stained, her dignity in tatters. Around her, the cream of society watched with a mixture of horror and fascination, like spectators at a gladiator fight. "Clean that up," Margaret commanded coldly. "Madi, nah, and try not to make another mess. Our guests didn't come here to watch the staff have a breakdown." The words hit Michelle like a slap. She looked around the room at all the faces staring at her, some pitying, some shocked, some clearly enjoying the spectacle. These people who had shared meals at her table, who had accepted her hospitality, who had smiled at her and complimented her home, were now watching her destruction with detached interest, but it was Todd's face that broke her heart completely. Her husband, the man she had loved and supported through everything, was smiling. Actually smiling as he watched her humiliation. "Well?" Margaret prompted. "We're waiting." Michelle slowly bent down and began picking up the larger pieces of broken glass, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grasp them. A bead of blood appeared where a shard cut her finger, bright red against her dark skin. "Careful there," Todd said mockingly. "We can't have you bleeding all over the marble. Mother just had it cleaned." That was when something inside Michelle finally snapped. She stood up slowly, the broken glass falling from her hands to crash again on the floor. When she raised her head, her eyes were no longer filled with hurt or confusion. They burned with something far more dangerous. "You know what?" Michelle said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "You're absolutely right." Todd's smile widened, thinking he had finally broken her completely. "I'm glad you're finally seeing reason. I am staff here," Michelle continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I've been cleaning up your messes, serving your needs, and maintaining this family's reputation for years. But you know what the difference is between me and the rest of your staff?" The room held its breath. "They get paid for their humiliation." Michelle reached down and pulled off her wedding ring, the beautiful diamond solitaire that Todd had placed on her finger with promises of forever. She held it up so everyone could see it sparkling in the chandelier light. "Here I am," she said, her voice ringing with newfound power as she placed the ring on the table in front of Todd. "Yours no more." Todd's smile vanished, like it had never existed. Chapter 2. The ring that fell silent. The silence in the ballroom was so complete that Michelle could hear her own heartbeat, thundering in her ears. Todd stared at the diamond ring sitting on the white tablecloth, like it was a bomb that might explode at any moment. His face had gone from confident cruelty to shocked confusion in the span of a heartbeat. Around them, the cream of society sat frozen, champagne glasses halfway to their lips, as they witnessed what would become the most talked-about moment in their social circle's history. The ring caught the light from the chandelier above, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the white linen. It was a beautiful ring, 3 carats, flawless clarity, set in platinum with smaller diamonds, creating a halo around the center stone. Todd had presented it to her with such ceremony, kneeling in the garden of this very house, while his family watched approvingly from the terrace. She remembered thinking then that it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever owned. Now it looked like a shackle she'd finally found the strength to break. "Michelle," Todd said slowly, his voice stripped of its earlier mockery, "what do you think you're doing?" The question revealed everything about their marriage in 6 simple words. Not "what's wrong?" or "how can I help?" or "I'm sorry," just the assumption that she was doing something to him. Rather than freeing herself from what he had done to her, "I'm doing what I should have done a long time ago," Michelle replied, her voice steady as steel. "I'm returning something that never really belonged to me anyway." The words felt like liberation as they left her lips. For years she had swallowed her pride, her hurt, her growing sense of worthlessness, believing that love meant sacrifice. She had convinced herself that a good wife absorbed criticism without complaint, that family harmony was worth any personal cost, that her own feelings mattered less than maintaining the Handy family's perfect image. Margaret Handy's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. She clutched her pearl necklace like it was a lifeline, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The control she had wielded over every family gathering, every social situation, every narrative, was slipping through her manicured fingers like sand. "You ungrateful little mother." Michelle's voice cut through Margaret's, sputtering like a blade. "For once in your life, be quiet and listen." The audacity of it sent shockwaves through the assembled guests. No one, absolutely no one, spoke to Margaret Handy that way, especially not the woman she had just publicly humiliated. Margaret was the undisputed queen of their social circle, the woman whose approval everyone sought, whose displeasure could end careers and close doors. But Michelle was no longer afraid of her power, no longer willing to be diminished by her cruelty. Michelle turned to face the room, her posture regal despite the champagne stains on her dress and the blood still seeping from her cut finger. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption to this lovely evening. You came here to celebrate love and commitment, and instead you've been forced to witness something far uglier." Mrs. Wellington leaned forward in her chair, her eyes bright with interest. "My dear, you have nothing to apologize for. If anything, we owe you an apology for sitting silently while my family put me in my place." Michelle's laugh was bitter but strong. "Oh, Mrs. Wellington, they did exactly that. They showed me precisely where I stand in this family, and for that, I'm actually grateful." Todd finally found his voice, panic creeping in as he began to realize the magnitude of what was happening. "Michelle, you're being dramatic. It was just a little fun, a harmless joke. You know how family gatherings can be harmless." Michelle's eyebrows rose elegantly. "Is that what you call it when you tell your friends that your wife is only good for bringing food? When your mother calls me staff in front of your sister's future in-laws? When you all stand by and watch me pick up broken glass with my bare hands while you laugh?" The color drained from Todd's face. Around the room, guests began whispering among themselves, and Michelle could see the horrified looks they were giving the Handy family. These people might be wealthy and privileged, but they still recognized cruelty when they saw it. "Son," Margaret hissed under her breath, "do something. Fix this, now." But Todd seemed paralyzed, finally understanding that his wife wasn't going to back down, wasn't going to swallow her humiliation and pretend it never happened. This wasn't the Michelle he thought he knew, the one who absorbed every insult and kept smiling. Victoria, who had been silent throughout the entire ordeal, suddenly stood up. "Michelle, I'm so sorry. This isn't what I wanted for my engagement party." "I never meant for Victoria," Michelle said gently, her voice softening for the first time since she'd dropped the tray. "This isn't your fault, sweetheart. You're getting married to a wonderful man who treats you with respect and love. Don't let what happened here tonight taint that happiness." She turned back to Todd, who was still staring at the ring like it might disappear if he looked away. "You want to know the funny thing about all this? I actually thought I belonged here. I thought if I just tried harder, loved more, gave more of myself, that eventually you would see me as part of this family, instead of an outsider who happened to marry into it." "You are part of this family," Todd said weakly, but even he didn't sound convinced. "No." Michelle shook her head. "I was a convenience, someone to manage your social calendar, to make your house run smoothly, to smile and nod and never complain no matter how badly I was treated. I was the perfect wife as long as I remembered that I was really just high-class hired help." Margaret finally erupted. "How dare you? After everything this family has done for you, after the life we've given you, this is how you repay us? With this dramatic little scene in front of our guests?" Michelle turned to face her mother-in-law with a smile that could have frozen fire. "The life you gave me." "Margaret, I think you're confused about who gave what to whom. But don't worry, you won't have to give me anything ever again." She picked up her small evening clutch from the table where she'd set it earlier, when she still thought she was a welcome member of this family. "I'll be collecting my things and leaving tonight. I'm sure you'll be much happier without the burden of having me around." "Michelle, wait." Todd finally stood up, reaching for her arm. "You can't just leave. We're married. This is your home." Michelle looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at his face. "Is it? Because for the last few hours you've all made it very clear that I'm not family, I'm not your wife, I'm just staff. Well, consider this my resignation." She pulled her arm free from his grasp with deliberate care. "Don't worry, Todd. I'm sure you'll find someone else to bring food for the family." The whispers around the room were growing louder now, and Michelle could see several guests pulling out their phones. By tomorrow, this story would be all over their social circles. The Handy family's reputation for elegance and sophistication would be replaced by whispers about how they treated the wife who had just walked away. "You'll be back," Margaret said venomously. Where are you going to go? What are you going to do? You need us more than we need you." Michelle paused at those words, turning back one final time. When she spoke, her voice carried across the room with quiet authority. "Margaret, that's where you're wrong. You see, you've spent so much time telling me what I am and what I'm worth that you never bothered to find out who I really am." She looked around the room one last time, taking in the shocked faces, the barely concealed excitement of those who loved a good scandal, and the growing horror of the bride's family as they realized what kind of people they were about to align themselves with. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for witnessing my liberation. I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening." Michelle walked toward the ballroom doors, with her head held high, her spine straight, and her dignity intact. Behind her, the room erupted in chaos as guests began talking all at once. Their voices a mix of shock, outrage, and barely contained excitement. She reached the doors and paused, her hand on the ornate brass handle. Without turning around, she spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Oh, and Victoria, congratulations on your engagement. I hope your marriage is nothing like mine." As Michelle stepped out of the ballroom and into the marble foyer beyond, she could hear Todd calling her name, his voice desperate now, pleading. But she didn't turn around. She didn't look back. The sound of her heels on the marble floor echoed through the grand hallway like a countdown to the end of everything the Handy family thought they knew about power, control, and the woman they had just lost forever. Chapter 3. The secret she left behind. The master bedroom felt like a mausoleum. As Michelle moved through it for the last time, she had shared this space with Todd for years, but tonight it felt foreign, like a hotel room where she'd never really belonged. The king-sized bed with its Egyptian cotton sheets, the antique vanity where she'd gotten ready for countless family gatherings, the walk-in closet filled with designer clothes that had never made her feel beautiful enough for this family. All of it suddenly seemed like props in someone else's life. The room held so many memories, most of them now tainted by what she'd learned about herself and her marriage. The reading nook by the window, where she'd spent countless hours with books, trying to escape the reality of her isolation. The sitting area where she'd waited for Todd to come home from his business trips, hoping each time that distance might have made him appreciate what he had. The enormous bathroom, where she'd cried silently in the shower, letting the water wash away tears she could never show anyone. She ran her fingers along the silk wallpaper she'd chosen when they'd first moved into this room, when she'd still believed she was making a home rather than decorating a prison. The pale blue pattern had reminded her of the sky, of freedom, of possibility. Now it just reminded her of how naive she'd been. Michelle pulled her leather suitcase from the closet, the one she'd bought for their honeymoon trip to Italy. Back then, she'd thought it was the beginning of their adventure together. Now she realized it had been the beginning of her slow disappearance into the role they'd created for her. The suitcase smelled faintly of lavender sachets and expensive perfume, remnants of happier trips when Todd had still pretended to enjoy her company. She remembered packing it for their anniversary getaway to Napa Valley, how excited she'd been to spend uninterrupted time with her husband. He'd spent most of the trip on business calls, leaving her to explore the vineyards alone while he dealt with urgent matters that couldn't wait. "Think, Michelle," she whispered to herself as she began folding clothes with practiced efficiency. "Take only what matters. Only what's truly yours." The irony wasn't lost on her. After years in this house, surrounded by luxury and wealth, she was struggling to identify what actually belonged to her versus what had been given to her as part of her role as Todd's wife. The jewelry he'd bought her for anniversaries and birthdays, were those gifts or payment for services rendered? The designer dresses Margaret had insisted she wear to family functions, were those expressions of love or costumes for the part she was expected to play? Each item she touched seemed to carry the weight of a memory, a moment when she'd convinced herself that material comfort could substitute for emotional connection. The cashmere sweater Todd had given her after a particularly cruel comment from his mother, was it an apology or just another way to keep her quiet? The silk scarf she'd worn to countless charity luncheons, playing the perfect society wife while dying inside. Was it hers, or just another prop in the performance of their marriage? In the end, she packed light. A few favorite outfits, some comfortable clothes, her grandmother's jewelry, and the photo albums from her childhood. The ones that reminded her of who she'd been before she became Mrs. Todd Handy. As she zipped up the suitcase, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Todd's voice carried through the closed door, speaking in hushed, urgent tones to someone, probably his mother, trying to figure out how to handle the disaster downstairs. "I don't know what got into her," Todd was saying. "She's never acted like this before. Maybe it's stress or hormones or something. Women can be so unpredictable." Michelle almost laughed. Even now, even after everything that had just happened, he was trying to explain away her actions as feminine hysteria rather than acknowledge that he'd driven her to this point. She moved to her vanity and carefully removed the small items that were purely hers. A lip balm her sister had given her, a hair tie that had sentimental value, a small bottle of perfume she'd bought herself. As she did, her fingers brushed against the hidden panel she'd discovered accidentally years ago while cleaning. For a moment, Michelle hesitated. Then she pulled out the concealed drawer she'd never mentioned to Todd or his family, the one where she'd kept her most precious secrets safe from their prying eyes and casual cruelties. Inside was a small wooden box her father had made for her as a child, carved with intricate flowers and painted with her initials. She hadn't looked inside it for months, but now she opened it carefully, as if it contained dynamite. The contents would have surprised anyone who thought they knew Michelle Anna Handy. Letters of recommendation from business leaders who'd worked with her years ago, before her marriage. Photographs of her standing with city officials at charity groundbreaking ceremonies. Documents showing her involvement in community projects that had transformed entire neighborhoods. Bank statements from accounts Todd had never known about, showing investments and donations that would make his trust fund look modest. But most damaging of all were the personal letters. Thank you notes from Margaret Handy herself, written during the family's darkest financial period, begging Michelle for help. Desperate emails from Todd's father, pleading with her to use her connections to save their reputation when a scandal had threatened to destroy them. Legal documents showing how Michelle had quietly used her own resources to pull the Handy family back from the brink of social and financial ruin. Michelle smiled bitterly as she read through her mother-in-law's handwritten words. "Dearest Michelle, I don't know how we'll ever repay you for what you've done for our family. You saved us when no one else would even take our calls. We are forever in your debt." That letter was dated just 2 years ago. Apparently, gratitude had a very short shelf life in the Handy household. She carefully arranged everything back in the box, adding a few more items, copies of financial documents, photographs from charity events where she'd been the honored guest, business cards from people who still respected her name. Then she wrote a simple note on her personal stationery. "For when you need to remember who I really was, before you convinced yourselves I was nothing." Michelle sealed the box and tucked it deep into the back of her drawer, behind old scarves and forgotten accessories. Let them find it someday, when they were looking for something else. Let them remember. The voices in the hallway were getting closer. She could hear Todd's footsteps approaching the bedroom door. Michelle grabbed her suitcase and moved to the window that overlooked the garden. Years ago, Todd had joked about the old-fashioned fire escape that connected to this window, saying it was charming but useless. Tonight, it would serve her well. She climbed out onto the metal platform with her bag, grateful for the darkness that would hide her escape. Below, she could see guests leaving the engagement party, their voices carrying up through the night air as they discussed what they'd witnessed. "I can't believe how they treated her," one woman was saying. "In front of everyone like that. It was absolutely horrible. Margaret Handy has always been cruel," another voice replied. "But I never thought Todd would be so heartless to his own wife. That poor girl." Poor girl." Michelle almost laughed at that. If they only knew what they were really witnessing, not the destruction of a helpless victim, but the liberation of a woman who had, been hiding her true power for far too long. She climbed down the fire escape with the skill of someone who had imagined this escape route many times during the worst moments of her marriage. When her feet touched the garden path, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: freedom. Michelle made her way to the garden gate that opened onto the side street, where she'd arranged for a taxi to wait. She'd planned this escape during the party, while serving drinks and pretending to be the perfect hostess. Even in her moment of crisis, she'd been thinking 3 steps ahead, a skill that had served her well in her previous life and would serve her again. As she settled into the back seat of the taxi, Michelle looked back at the handy mansion one last time. Light spilled from the ballroom windows, and she could see silhouettes of people still talking, still processing what they'd witnessed. In a few minutes, Todd would discover her missing from their bedroom. He'd probably assume she was somewhere in the house, sulking or crying. It would be hours before they realized she was truly gone. "Where to, miss?" the taxi driver asked kindly. Michelle gave him the address of a hotel downtown, one she'd chosen specifically because it was the kind of place the Handy family would never think to look for her. As the car pulled away from the curb, she allowed herself one small smile. Phase 1 was complete. She was free from the cage she'd been living in. But freedom was just the beginning. Now came the part that would really surprise them, showing the world who Michelle Anna had been before she'd made the mistake of trying to become Michelle Anna Handy. The taxi disappeared into the night, carrying with it the woman who had just stopped pretending to be powerless. Chapter 4. The lies begin to spread. 3 days after Michelle's dramatic exit, the Handy household was drowning in damage control and increasingly desperate lies. Margaret Handy sat in her pristine morning room, surrounded by wedding planning materials and growing panic, as she fielded yet another phone call from Victoria's future mother-in-law. The Wellingtons had been calling constantly since the engagement party, and each conversation was becoming more difficult to navigate. The morning room had always been Margaret's sanctuary, her private domain where she planned social campaigns and managed family crises. The pale yellow walls were adorned with photographs of family achievements: Todd's graduation from Harvard, Victoria's debutante ball, Margaret's own charity committee appointments. But today, those symbols of success felt like mockeries as Margaret watched her carefully constructed world crumble around her. She'd barely slept since the engagement party disaster. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Michelle's face in that final moment, not broken or defeated as Margaret had expected, but radiating a quiet strength that had been far more terrifying than tears would have been. The image haunted her, challenging everything she'd believed about power, control, and the natural order of their family hierarchy. The society pages had been brutal that morning. While they hadn't named names directly, the gossip columnist's description of a prominent family's shocking treatment of their daughter-in-law at a recent social gathering had been unmistakably about them. Margaret's phone had been ringing all morning with calls from women eager to express their concern while fishing for details. "Margaret?" "Oh, darling," Mrs. Wellington's voice carried through the speakerphone with thinly veiled concern. "Charles and I have been simply beside ourselves since the party. We can't stop thinking about your daughter-in-law. That poor dear looked so distressed when she left. Is she quite all right?" The false sympathy in the question made Margaret's skin crawl. She could hear the judgment underneath the polite concern, could sense that the Wellingtons were already questioning their decision to align their family with the Handys. Margaret had spent years cultivating their respect, years positioning her family as worthy of the Wellington connection. And Michelle had destroyed it all in one dramatic moment. Margaret's knuckles went white as she gripped her coffee cup. "Oh, Michelle is perfectly fine, Patricia. You know how dramatic some people can be. She's just taking a little time to herself. Taking time to herself." There was a pause. "But surely she's involved in the wedding planning." "Victoria told me that Michelle was going to help coordinate the bridal shower." "And what about the rehearsal dinner?" I thought she was handling the floral arrangements. Each question was like a needle under Margaret's fingernails. For 3 days, she'd been spinning the same web of lies, telling anyone who asked that Michelle was simply taking a brief vacation, or visiting a sick relative, or dealing with a family emergency. But the stories were beginning to contradict each other, and people were starting to notice. The truth was that Margaret had no idea where Michelle was or what she was planning. Todd had been driving around the city like a madman, checking hotels and calling mutual friends. But Michelle seemed to have vanished completely. Her credit cards hadn't been used. Her phone went straight to voicemail, and none of their social connections had seen or heard from her. It was as if she'd simply ceased to exist, taking with her all the secrets and vulnerabilities she'd witnessed during her years as part of their family. Well, Margaret said carefully, Michelle has always been, how shall I put this delicately, a bit unstable, prone to these little dramatic episodes. You witnessed one yourself at the party. Unstable. Mrs. Wellington's voice sharpened. Margaret, forgive me for speaking plainly, but what I witnessed at the party wasn't instability. It was a woman being publicly humiliated by her own family. Charles and I have been married for 35 years, and I've never seen anything quite so... So what? Margaret's voice had an edge to it now. So cruel, Mrs. Wellington finished quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret could feel her carefully constructed social facade beginning to crack. For decades, she'd been the undisputed queen of their social circle, the woman whose approval everyone sought. But now she could sense that approval slipping away with each passing day. I think there may have been some misunderstanding about what you saw, Margaret said finally. Michelle has always been, well, she's always been more comfortable in a serving role. She actually prefers it. Some people are just naturally suited to be helpers rather than leaders. Are you suggesting, Mrs. Wellington said slowly, that your son's wife enjoys being treated like hired help at family gatherings? Margaret realized she was digging herself deeper into a hole, but she couldn't seem to stop. What I'm saying is that Michelle has always known her place in this family. Some people are born to lead, and others are born to follow. It's not cruel, it's simply the natural order of things. Upstairs, Todd was having his own crisis management conversation with Victoria's fiancé, James Wellington. The two men sat in Todd's study, surrounded by the leather-bound books and mahogany furniture that was supposed to make Todd feel powerful and in control. Instead, he felt like everything was spinning away from him. I have to ask, Todd, James said carefully, and please don't take this the wrong way, but what exactly is going on with your wife? Todd had been dreading this conversation. James was a good man, the kind of man who actually respected his fiancée and treated her as an equal partner. The kind of man Todd had never learned to be. Michelle's just going through a difficult time, Todd said, pouring himself a scotch even though it wasn't yet noon. You know how women can be emotional, unpredictable. No, James said firmly. I don't know how women can be because I've never seen Victoria or any other woman I respect behave the way your wife did at the party. And I've certainly never seen a woman have a breakdown like that without good reason. Todd felt his temper flare. Look, James, I appreciate your concern, but this is really none of your business. Michelle is my wife, and I'll handle the situation however I see fit. It became my business when it happened at my fiancé's engagement party, James replied calmly. And it became my family's business when you all stood there and watched that woman pick up broken glass with her bare hands while you laughed about it. She was being dramatic. She was bleeding. Todd, James's voice was quiet but steel-hard. Your wife was bleeding, and you called her a servant in front of 50 people. That's not drama. That's abuse. The word hung in the air between them like a bomb. Todd had never thought of it that way, had never allowed himself to examine his behavior through that lens. In his mind, he'd simply been putting Michelle in her place, maintaining the family hierarchy that his mother had drilled into him since childhood. You don't understand the dynamics of our marriage, Todd said weakly. You're right, James agreed. I don't understand how a man can humiliate his wife in public and then act surprised when she leaves him. She didn't leave me, Todd said automatically, then realized how pathetic that sounded. She's just taking some space. Todd. James leaned forward in his chair. My parents have been trying to reach Michelle about the wedding planning. No one has seen or heard from her in 3 days. Her phone goes straight to voicemail. The staff at your country club said she cancelled all her committee memberships. That doesn't sound like taking space. That sounds like she's gone. The truth hit Todd like a physical blow. He'd been telling himself that Michelle would come crawling back once she'd cooled off, once she'd realized how good she had it in the Handy family. But the evidence was mounting that she had no intention of returning. Where is she staying? James asked gently. I don't know. Have you tried to find her? To apologize? Apologize for what? The words came out more defensively than Todd intended. For maintaining order in my own house? For not letting her get above herself? James stared at him with something approaching disgust. Listen to yourself, Todd. You're talking about your wife like she's a rebellious employee instead of the woman you supposedly love. Of course I love her, Todd protested. But love doesn't mean letting someone walk all over you. Michelle needed to be reminded of her role in this family. And what role is that exactly? Todd opened his mouth to answer, then realized he couldn't articulate it without sounding like exactly what James was accusing him of being. How could he explain that Michelle's role was to make him look good, to manage his household, to absorb his family's casual cruelties with a smile? How could he make James understand that this was simply how things worked in families like theirs? The wedding is in 6 weeks, James said quietly. My family has invested a considerable amount of time, money, and emotional energy into planning this celebration with yours. But I need to know, are we aligning ourselves with people who share our values? What's that supposed to mean? It means my parents didn't raise me to be part of a family that treats women like disposable servants. It means Victoria deserves better than to marry into a family where wives can be publicly humiliated for sport. Todd felt panic rising in his chest. The Wellington family was everything the Handys aspired to be. Old money, respected, connected to all the right people. Losing this alliance would be a social disaster. James, you're overreacting. This is just a minor marital disagreement. Minor? James stood up, his face hard. Todd, your wife removed her wedding ring and walked out of your life in front of 50 witnesses. That's not minor. That's catastrophic. As James headed for the door, he paused and looked back. Find her, Todd. Make this right. Because if Michelle doesn't return to be part of this wedding, my family will have some very serious questions about whether this marriage should happen at all. The door closed behind him with a finality that made Todd's blood run. Chapter 5. The Woman Who Disappeared. Michelle stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her downtown hotel suite, watching the city wake up beneath a canopy of soft morning clouds. For the first time in years, she had slept through the night without waking up in a cold sweat, wondering what criticism would greet her at breakfast, what social landmine she would have to navigate, what impossible standard she would fail to meet. The silence in her hotel room wasn't the oppressive quiet of the Handy mansion. It was peaceful, full of possibility. The hotel suite was a far cry from the opulent rooms she'd grown accustomed to as Todd's wife, but it felt more like home than the mansion ever had. The clean lines, neutral colors, and simple elegance spoke to her soul in a way that all of Margaret's antiques and inherited grandeur never could. Here, surrounded by space she'd chosen and paid for herself, Michelle could finally breathe. She'd deliberately chosen this hotel for its anonymity and discretion. The staff asked no questions. The other guests minded their own business, and the concierge was skilled at deflecting inquiries from unwanted visitors. After years of living under constant scrutiny, the freedom to move through her days without judgment felt almost intoxicating. The view from her window encompassed the city she was slowly reclaiming as her own. Below, she could see people hurrying to work, street vendors setting up their carts, joggers making their morning circuits through the nearby park. It was a view of real life, of people who worked for their dreams and built their own worth, rather than the insulated bubble of inherited privilege she'd been trapped in for so long. Her phone buzzed on the marble nightstand, displaying Todd's name for the 47th time since she'd left. She'd stopped counting the voicemails from Margaret. The desperation in their messages had evolved from anger to bargaining to outright panic. But Michelle felt nothing but a curious detachment as she listened to their increasingly frantic attempts to lure her back. The evolution of Todd's messages told the story of a man slowly realizing what he'd lost. The first had been dismissive. "Michelle, sweetheart, please call me back. Mother was wrong to say those things, but you know how she gets at social gatherings. Come home and we'll work this out." That had been Todd's first message, delivered with the casual confidence of a man who assumed his wife's rebellion was temporary. By the 10th message, his tone had changed. "Michelle, this isn't funny anymore. People are asking questions. You're embarrassing the family with this dramatic disappearance act." The most recent voicemail, left at 3 in the morning, revealed a man beginning to understand the magnitude of his loss. "Michelle, please. I know I made mistakes, but we can fix this. You can't just throw away our marriage over one bad night. Call me back, please." Michelle deleted all of them without responding. Each unanswered call, each ignored message was a small act of reclamation. For years, she'd been available to them 24 hours a day, ready to solve their problems, manage their crises, and absorb their frustrations. Now, for the first time, she was choosing when and how to engage with the world on her own terms. Instead, she opened her laptop and began making the calls she should have made years ago. The first was to her former mentor, Dr. Demi Moore, who had guided her through her early philanthropic work before Michelle had gotten distracted by playing the perfect wife. "Michelle Anna?" Dr. Demi Moore's voice was warm with surprise and delight. "My goodness, I was just thinking about you. I heard through the grapevine that you were married to the Handy family, but you've been so quiet lately. How are you, dear?" Michelle paused, realizing she couldn't remember the last time someone had asked her that question and actually wanted to hear the real answer. "I'm getting back to myself, Sarah, and I was hoping we could talk about some opportunities." Within an hour, Michelle had reconnected with 5 different organizations she'd worked with before her marriage. Within 2 hours, she'd scheduled 3 lunch meetings for the upcoming week. By noon, she'd been invited to join the Board of Directors for a Children's Literacy Foundation, a position that would put her back in the center of the philanthropic community she'd abandoned to become Todd's perfect accessory. The city was already buzzing with whispers about her dramatic exit from the engagement party. Michelle's phone rang constantly with calls from society reporters, curious friends, and people who simply wanted to hear the gossip firsthand. She ignored most of them, but she did accept a call from her old friend Catherine Morrison, who ran the city's most exclusive women's club. "Michelle." "Darling," Catherine's voice was breathless with excitement. "Please tell me the rumors aren't true. Please tell me you didn't actually drop your wedding ring and walk out of a Handy family party." "Oh, they're true," Michelle said calmly. "Every word." "My God," Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right? Do you need anything? A place to stay, legal advice, a shoulder to cry on?" The genuine concern in Catherine's voice almost brought tears to Michelle's eyes. When was the last time someone in her social circle had offered help instead of judgment? "I'm fine, Catherine. Better than fine, actually. But I appreciate the offer." "Well, you know there's already talk about..." "Well, about what really happened." "Margaret's been calling everyone she knows, trying to control the narrative. She's telling people you had some sort of breakdown, that you've always been unstable." Michelle's laugh was sharp. "Of course she is. What else is she saying? Daddy, that you were just a servant who got ideas above your station, that Todd married you out of pity, that the family took you in as an act of charity and you repaid them with ingratitude." Catherine's voice was disgusted. "It's absolutely vicious, Michelle. I wanted you to know what you're up against." "I appreciate the warning," Michelle said. But Margaret Handy has no idea what she's up against. That afternoon, Michelle made her first public appearance since leaving the mansion. She walked into the lobby of the Meridian Country Club, the most exclusive club in the city, and one where the Handy family had never been able to secure membership despite years of trying, with her head high and her confidence restored. The maitre d' recognized her immediately. "Miss Anna, what a pleasant surprise. We haven't seen you in far too long. Your usual table?" The use of her maiden name wasn't accidental. Michelle had specifically requested that they stop using Mrs. Handy when she'd called to make the reservation. The staff at the Meridian had always treated her with respect, even before her marriage, because they recognized her worth, independent of her husband's family name. As Michelle was seated at her preferred table overlooking the gardens, she noticed the whispers starting immediately. Several members approached her throughout lunch, offering support and expressing shock at what they'd heard about the engagement party. It became clear that the story was spreading rapidly through their social circles, and the Handy family was not coming off well in the telling. "My dear Mrs. Ashford," one of the club's founding members said as she stopped by Michelle's table, "I hope you know that many of us have been appalled by what we've heard about your treatment. Margaret Handy has always been an unpleasant woman, but this crosses every line of decency." "You're very kind," Michelle replied gracefully. "Kind nothing. It's simply the truth. I've known you since you were organizing charity drives fresh out of college, and you've always been a woman of substance and character. Anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve you." As word spread that Michelle was at the club, more people approached her table. Some were offering support, others were clearly fishing for gossip, but all of them were treating her with the respect and attention she'd forgotten she deserved. Dr. Demi Moore, the president of the city's largest children's hospital, stopped by during dessert. "Michelle, I heard you might be interested in getting back involved with charitable work. We're launching a new initiative for underprivileged children, and we need someone with your experience and connections to chair the committee." "I'd be honored," Michelle said without hesitation. "Wonderful. There's just one thing. The position comes with a significant public profile. Magazine interviews, speaking engagements, that sort of thing. Given your current situation, I wanted to make sure you're prepared for the attention." Michelle's smile was radiant. "Sarah, I've been hiding my light under a bushel for far too long. I'm ready to shine." As she left the club that evening, Michelle felt a transformation happening inside her that was almost physical. The woman who had walked out of the Handy mansion 3 days ago had been broken and humiliated. The woman walking down the club's marble steps was remembered, who she'd been before she'd tried to shrink herself to fit into someone else's idea of what she should be. Her phone buzzed with a text. "From an unknown number. Miss Anna, this is James Wellington, Victoria's fiancé. I was wondering if we could talk. Would you be available for coffee tomorrow? There are some things about the wedding that I think you should know." Michelle stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Of course. Let's meet at the Meridian at 10. I think there are some things you should know too." As she walked to her car, Michelle could see several other club members watching her through the windows, their faces filled with something she hadn't seen directed at her in years: admiration. The woman they were watching wasn't Todd Handy's wife or Margaret Handy's daughter-in-law. She was Michelle Anna, and she was back. Chapter 6. The Mother's Desperate Search. Margaret Handy had never begged for anything in her life, but as she sat in the back of her Mercedes outside the Meridian Country Club, she was preparing to do exactly that. For a week, she'd been tracking Michelle's movements through their social network like a hunter stalking prey. Every phone call to mutual acquaintances, every casual inquiry disguised as concern, every favor called in with society photographers and gossip columnists had led her to this moment. Michelle was inside the club that had rejected the Handy family's membership application 3 times, having lunch with some of the most influential women in the city. The exclusivity of the Meridian had always been a thorn in Margaret's side. Despite her family's wealth and social climbing, despite Todd's business connections and her own charitable work, they had never been deemed worthy of membership. The rejection letters had been politely worded but devastating, each one a reminder that there were circles of power and influence that remained forever closed to them. And now Michelle, the woman Margaret had treated as a servant, was dining there as if she belonged. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she applied fresh lipstick in her compact mirror. She'd always prided herself on her composure, her ability to maintain control in any situation. She was the woman who could silence a room with a raised eyebrow, who could destroy reputations with a carefully placed whisper, who could manipulate any social situation to her advantage. But watching her carefully constructed world crumble over the past week had shaken her to her core. The morning newspapers had been particularly brutal. The society columnist for the Herald had written a thinly veiled piece about charitable angels who worked tirelessly behind the scenes, only to be publicly humiliated by the very families they'd saved. Everyone in their social circle would know exactly who she was referring to. Margaret's phone had been ringing constantly with calls from women who had always envied her position, now barely concealing their glee as they offered support that felt more like gloating. Margaret, darling, her supposed friend Constance Pemberton had called just that morning. I heard the most disturbing rumors about your family situation. I do hope you're weathering this storm with your usual grace. The false sympathy had been worse than outright hostility. Margaret could hear the satisfaction in Constance's voice, the joy of watching someone fall from grace. For decades, Margaret had held the upper hand in their friendship, had been the one whose approval mattered, whose invitations were coveted. Now she could feel that power slipping away with each whispered conversation, each knowing glance at social gatherings. The wedding preparations were in chaos. The Wellingtons were asking increasingly pointed questions about Michelle's absence. Victoria was in tears daily, caught between loyalty to her family and her horror at what had happened at her engagement party. And Todd was falling apart completely, alternating between rage and despair as he realized the magnitude of what he'd lost. But most terrifying of all were the whispers. Margaret's phone had been ringing constantly with poorly disguised glee from women who had always envied her position in society. Under the guise of concern, they were spreading every detail of Michelle's dramatic exit, and each retelling made the Handy family look worse. Margaret, darling, Vivian Ashworth had cooed just that morning. I heard the most concerning rumors about your daughter-in-law. Is it true she was so distressed at Victoria's party that she actually threw her wedding ring at Todd? In front of everyone? The story had already grown in the telling. By some accounts, Michelle had screamed obscenities. In others, she'd physically attacked Todd. Margaret had tried to correct the narrative. But the truth was almost worse than the fiction. A calm, dignified woman had simply decided she'd had enough. Now, watching Michelle through the club's windows as she laughed with Dr. Demi Moore over what appeared to be a very pleasant lunch, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: powerlessness. She waited until Michelle emerged from the club, then instructed her driver to pull up just as Michelle reached her car. "Michelle," Margaret called through the lowered window, trying to inject warmth into her voice. "What a lovely surprise running into you here." Michelle turned slowly, her expression completely neutral. She looked radiant, her skin glowing, her posture confident, her designer dress perfectly fitted. She looked like a woman who had been freed from prison, rather than one who had lost everything. "Margaret," Michelle said politely, "how nice to see you." The calm civility was more unsettling than anger would have been. Margaret was prepared for tears, recriminations, demands for apologies. She wasn't prepared for this poised stranger who spoke to her like a casual acquaintance. "I was hoping we could talk, dear. Perhaps you'd join me for coffee. There's so much we need to discuss." "I'm afraid I have another appointment," Michelle replied smoothly. "But please, say whatever you came to say." Margaret glanced around nervously. They were standing in the club's parking area, where any number of people might overhear. "This is rather private, Michelle." "Family business." "I'm no longer family," Michelle said simply. "You made that very clear at Victoria's party. So anything you have to say to me can be said right here." The words hit Margaret like a slap. She'd spent the week crafting careful speeches about misunderstandings and overreactions, but Michelle's calm certainty was dismantling every argument before she could make it. "Michelle, please." Margaret stepped out of the car, abandoning all pretense of casual encounter. "You're being unreasonable. One bad evening doesn't erase years of marriage, years of being part of our family." "One bad evening?" Michelle's eyebrows rose slightly. "Margaret, that wasn't one bad evening. That was the culmination of years of systematic humiliation, casual cruelty, and deliberate attempts to make me feel worthless. The only difference was that it finally happened in public." "That's not," Margaret began, but Michelle held up a hand. "Let me ask you something," Michelle said quietly. "In all the years I was married to your son, can you name one time, just one, when you treated me like I actually mattered? When you spoke to me with respect? When you acknowledged my contributions to your family without immediately diminishing them?" Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it again. The question hung in the air between them like a challenge she couldn't meet. "I thought so," Michelle said sadly. "You know, Margaret, I used to think there was something wrong with me. I thought if I just tried harder, loved more, gave more of myself, that eventually you and Todd would see me as worthy of basic human dignity. But I realize now that the problem was never me." "Michelle, you don't understand the pressure we've been under." "The pressure?" Michelle's voice sharpened for the first time. "You want to talk about pressure? Do you have any idea what it's like to live in a house where your own husband introduces you as just the help to his friends? Where your mother-in-law openly discusses your inadequacies at dinner parties? Where every conversation feels like a test you're destined to fail?" Margaret felt her own temper rising. "We gave you everything. A beautiful home, a respected family name, entry into the best social circles." "You gave me nothing," Michelle interrupted, her voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel. "I earned my place in those social circles long before I met Todd. The beautiful home, I decorated it, managed it, and made it functional. The respected family name, it was the one protecting it when your husband's gambling debts and your son's business failures threatened to destroy your reputation." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. "How dare you? How dare I what?" "Tell the truth." Michelle stepped closer, and Margaret instinctively stepped back. "You want to know why the Wellingtons are asking so many questions about me? Because they remember when your family was on the verge of social and financial ruin, and they remember who pulled you back from the brink. It wasn't your connections or your family name, it was mine." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. She'd conveniently forgotten about that dark period, when her husband's poor investments and Todd's failed ventures had brought them to the edge of disaster. Michelle had quietly used her own resources and connections to solve their problems, and Margaret had been so relieved that she'd never bothered to thank her properly or remember her debt. "I want you to come home," Margaret said desperately, abandoning all her carefully prepared arguments. "The family needs you. Todd needs you. Victoria's wedding will be beautiful with or without me," Michelle finished. "Victoria deserves to marry into the Wellington family. They're good people who will treat her with respect and love. But that has nothing to do with me anymore. But the social implications of what? Of you finally being revealed as the kind of people who humiliate their own family members in public. Margaret, I spent years protecting your reputation. Now you get to live with the consequences of your own actions." Margaret felt panic rising in her chest. "What do you want? Money, an apology? Name your price, Michelle. Anything." The pity in Michelle's eyes was worse than anger would have been. "I don't want anything from you, Margaret. For the first time in years, I'm free from wanting anything from the Handy family. Do you have any idea how liberating that is?" "You'll be back," Margaret said venomously, her desperation turning to rage. "You have nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. You need us more than we need you." Michelle smiled, a genuinely peaceful smile that made Margaret's blood run cold. "You know what the interesting thing is about that statement? You actually believe it. You've convinced yourselves that I'm nothing without you, that I have no value independent of being Todd's wife." She pulled out her phone and showed Margaret a photo from her lunch. "This is Dr. Demi Moore, offering me the chairmanship of the new Children's Hospital Foundation. This is me accepting a position that will put me in charge of a $50 million initiative." Margaret stared at the photo, recognition dawning. Demi Moore was one of the most powerful women in the city, someone the Handy family had never been able to access despite years of trying. "You see, Margaret, you never bothered to find out who I was before I became your son's wife. You never asked about my background, my education, my connections, my achievements. You just assumed I was some nobody who should be grateful for the crumbs you threw me." Michelle put her phone away and looked directly into Margaret's eyes. "Your biggest mistake wasn't humiliating me at that party. Your biggest mistake was assuming I was powerless." She turned to walk toward her car, then paused and looked back. "Oh, and Margaret, you might want to check your mail. I believe there are some items I left behind that you'll find illuminating." As Michelle drove away, Margaret stood alone in the parking lot, finally understanding that she hadn't just lost a daughter-in-law. She'd made an enemy of the one person who had been protecting her family from themselves. Chapter 7. The Empire She Builds in Shadows. 2 weeks after her confrontation with Margaret, Michelle stood at the podium of the Grand Ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton, addressing an audience of 300 of the city's most influential philanthropists and community leaders. In the days following her encounter with Margaret in the country club parking lot, Michelle had thrown herself into rebuilding her professional network with renewed determination. Margaret's desperate attempts to manipulate her had only reinforced Michelle's resolve to reclaim her independence completely. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the woman who had once served drinks at her own family gatherings. In her place stood someone radiant with purpose and power, commanding the room with natural authority that no amount of money could buy. The ballroom itself seemed to glow under the crystal chandeliers, but the real brilliance came from Michelle herself. She wore a midnight blue gown that spoke of elegance and authority, her posture regal, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space without seeming to strain. This was the woman she'd been before her marriage, the one who had been buried under years of criticism and diminishment, now fully restored to her former glory. The audience before her represented the true power structure of the city, not the social climbers and inherited wealth that dominated Margaret's circles, but the people who actually made things happen. Doctors, educators, community organizers, business leaders who had built their success through merit rather than birthright. These were Michelle's people, the ones who recognized substance over style, achievement over pedigree. "Ladies and gentlemen," Michelle began, her voice carrying clearly through the elegant space, "tonight we launch not just a foundation, but a revolution in how we approach childhood education in our city." The audience was captivated. Michelle had spent 2 weeks crafting this moment, using connections she'd built over years of quiet philanthropy to create something that would put her firmly back in the center of the social and charitable world that truly mattered. Every word had been chosen carefully, every proposal backed by solid research and genuine passion. As she spoke about literacy rates in underserved communities, about the potential that was being wasted every day, about the ripple effect that education could have on entire neighborhoods, Michelle felt the familiar fire that had driven her before her marriage. This was her calling, her true purpose, and standing here at this podium felt like coming home after years of exile. "We're not just talking about teaching children to read," she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. We're talking about breaking cycles of poverty, opening doors that have been closed for generations, and giving every child in our city the tools they need to write their own success stories. Dr. Demi Moore sat at the head table, beaming with pride at her choice of foundation chair. I knew Michelle Anna was exactly what we needed, she'd told the board earlier. She has the vision, the connections, and the credibility to make this initiative something truly special. What none of them knew was how strategic Michelle's return had been. Every lunch meeting, every phone call, every carefully orchestrated appearance had been designed to rebuild her influence, while remaining completely independent of the Handy family name. She was creating her own empire, and she was doing it with the precision of a master chess player who had finally learned the value of thinking several moves ahead. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was using skills Todd and Margaret had never bothered to recognize. They'd seen her organizational abilities only in the context of managing their social calendar, had dismissed her networking as mere social climbing, had never understood that her genuine care for others made her infinitely more powerful than their calculated manipulations ever could be. As Michelle outlined the Foundation's ambitious goals, scholarships for underprivileged children, literacy programs in underserved communities, mentorship opportunities that would change lives, she noticed several familiar faces in the audience. Catherine Morrison, from the Women's Club, sitting in the front row and applauding enthusiastically. Dr. Demi Moore, her former mentor, who had become the hospital president, nodding approvingly from the third table. And in the back, barely visible in the shadows, was someone she hadn't expected to see. James Wellington was watching her speech with an expression of growing understanding and admiration. After the presentation, as guests mingled over cocktails and hors d'oeuvres, Michelle found herself surrounded by people eager to contribute to her cause, to be associated with her vision. Checks were being written, commitments were being made, and Michelle was reminded of why she'd fallen in love with this work in the first place. Ms. Anna, a young reporter from the Society pages, approached with his photographer. Could we get a quote about your return to philanthropic leadership? There's been quite a bit of curiosity about your recent life changes. Michelle smiled graciously. I'm simply returning to the work that has always been most important to me. Sometimes life circumstances force us to step back from our true calling, but I've learned that it's never too late to reclaim your purpose. The reporter scribbled notes, clearly hoping for something more scandalous. But Michelle had become expert at giving perfect quotes that revealed nothing while saying everything. And what about the rumors regarding your marriage to Todd Handy? Is it true that you've separated? I prefer to focus on the future rather than the past, Michelle replied smoothly. Tonight is about the children we're going to help, not about personal matters that have no bearing on this important work. As the reporter moved away, James Wellington approached. He'd been waiting patiently for an opportunity to speak with her privately. Miss Anna, he said formally, thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Could we perhaps step onto the terrace? There are some things I think we need to discuss. Michelle nodded and followed him out to the hotel's elegant outdoor space, where the city lights sparkled below them like earthbound stars. That was an impressive presentation, James began. I had no idea about the scope of your philanthropic background. My family has been asking questions about you since the engagement party, and what we've discovered is enlightening. Oh? Michelle kept her voice neutral, though she had a good idea where this conversation was headed. We've learned that you're not exactly who the Handy family portrayed you to be. In fact, you're quite the opposite. James paused, choosing his words carefully. My father made some calls to people in the charitable community. Your reputation precedes you, Miss Anna, and it's a very impressive reputation indeed. Michelle remained silent, allowing him to continue. The question my family has is this. Why would someone of your stature and independence allow herself to be treated the way you were at Victoria's party? And more importantly, What does that treatment say about the family my fiancé is about to marry into? It was the opening Michelle had been hoping for, not to destroy Victoria's happiness, but to ensure that the Wellington family understood exactly what kind of people they were aligning themselves with. "James," she said carefully, "I assume you love Victoria very much." "More than life itself," he replied without hesitation. "Then you need to understand that what you witnessed at that party wasn't an aberration. It was simply the first time the Handy family's true nature was exposed to public scrutiny." She moved to the terrace railing, looking out over the city. "I spent years trying to be the perfect daughter-in-law, the perfect wife. I absorbed their criticism, their casual cruelties, their constant attempts to diminish me, because I believed that love meant sacrifice. I thought if I just gave enough of myself, they would eventually see my worth. But they never did." "No," Michelle said quietly. "They never did. Because people like Margaret and Todd Handy don't see other people as having inherent worth. They see people as either useful or disposable. For years I was useful. I managed their social calendar, cleaned up their messes, used my connections to solve their problems. But I was never valued." James was quiet for a long moment. "Victoria isn't like that." "No," Michelle agreed. "Victoria is a lovely girl with a good heart. But she's been raised in that environment, James. She's been taught to accept their behavior as normal, to excuse their cruelties as family quirks." "What are you saying?" Michelle turned to face him directly. "I'm saying that if you marry into the Handy family, you need to understand that their love comes with conditions. Their acceptance requires conformity, and their version of family loyalty means never questioning their right to treat others poorly. But surely Victoria would never." "Victoria stood by and watched them humiliate me," Michelle said gently but firmly. "She was horrified, yes, but she didn't speak up until it was too late. She's been trained to prioritize family harmony over individual dignity, to value appearances over truth." James looked stricken. "What are you suggesting I do? Call off the wedding?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Michelle replied. "I'm simply sharing my experience so you can make informed decisions about your future. Victoria has the potential to be different, but she'll need a partner who's strong enough to help her break free from her family's toxic patterns." She placed a gentle hand on his arm. "If you love her enough to fight for her, to help her see that there's a better way to live, then maybe you can have the marriage I never could. But it will require courage, James. It will require standing up to them when they inevitably try to control and diminish her the way they did me." James nodded slowly, clearly processing everything she'd told him. "Is there anything else I should know?" Michelle smiled mysteriously. "Ask Victoria about the box I left in my old room. Ask her to show you what's inside. And then ask yourself if you want to be part of a family that forgets the people who save them." As they returned to the ballroom, Michelle felt a sense of completion. She'd planted the seeds that needed to be planted, given James the information he needed to make an informed choice about his future. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and commitments. By the time Michelle returned to her hotel suite, she'd raised over $2 million for the foundation and secured partnerships with 5 major corporations. As she prepared for bed, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "The box has been found. We need to talk." "Victoria." Michelle smiled as she turned off the lights. Phase 2 was about to begin. Chapter 8. The Magazine That Reveals All. Victoria Handy sat in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by the contents of the wooden box she'd discovered hidden in Michelle's old dresser, and felt her entire world shifting beneath her feet. She had come to Michelle's former room, looking for answers, desperate to understand what had driven her sister-in-law to such a dramatic departure. While searching through the dresser drawers for any clue that might explain Michelle's actions, Victoria had noticed that one drawer seemed shorter than the others. Her exploration had revealed the hidden compartment and the wooden box that would change everything she thought she knew about her family. The magazine lay open before her, a prestigious publication featuring the city's most influential philanthropists from 3 years ago. On the cover, radiant and confident, was Michelle Anna, not Michelle Handy, but Michelle Anna, identified as rising star in urban development and child advocacy. The accompanying article detailed her work transforming struggling neighborhoods, her innovative approach to youth mentorship, and her growing influence in charitable circles. The mysterious Ms. Anna, the article read, prefers to work behind the scenes, but her impact is undeniable. City officials credit her with saving 3 community centers from closure, and her scholarship program has already changed hundreds of lives. Victoria stared at the photo with growing horror. This wasn't the woman her family had described as a fortunate nobody who'd married above her station. This was someone who had already achieved remarkable things before she'd ever met Todd. The other contents of the box were even more damning. Letters from Victoria's own grandmother, thanking Michelle for her generous assistance during our family's difficult period. Financial documents showing Michelle's personal investments in failing Handy family ventures. Thank you notes from Margaret herself, written in her distinctive handwriting, expressing gratitude for Michelle's help in avoiding social embarrassment when Todd's business failures had threatened their reputation. Most shocking of all was a letter from Victoria's own father, written just 3 years ago. Dear Michelle, I cannot express how grateful we are for your intervention with the bank. Without your financial backing and connections, we would have lost everything. Your loyalty to this family will never be forgotten. Victoria felt sick. All these years, she'd watched her family treat Michelle with casual dismissiveness, never realizing that Michelle had literally saved them from ruin. The woman they'd called a servant had been their guardian angel, and they'd repaid her kindness with systematic humiliation. Her phone buzzed with a call from James, and she answered with trembling hands. Victoria, sweetheart, are you all right? You sounded upset in your text. James, I need you to come over, right now. There's something you need to see. What's wrong? Did something happen? Victoria looked around at the scattered documents that painted her family as ungrateful liars. Everything I thought I knew about my family was wrong. Everything they told us about Michelle was a lie. An hour later, James sat beside Victoria on her bed, reading through the documents with growing amazement and disgust. The magazine article alone was enough to completely reframe everything they thought they knew about Michelle. But the personal letters from Victoria's family members were devastating. My God, Victoria, James said quietly. She saved your family multiple times, and they treated her like hired help. It's worse than that, Victoria whispered, holding up a bank statement showing a massive transfer from Michelle's personal account to cover Todd's gambling debts. She didn't just help them, she bankrolled them. Without her money, we would have lost the house, the country club membership, everything. James picked up the magazine and studied Michelle's photo again. Look at her in this picture. She's confident, powerful, respected. What did your family do to her to make her so small and quiet? Victoria had been asking herself the same question. The Michelle she'd known had been reserved, almost invisible at family gatherings. She'd spoken only when spoken to, served others before herself, and absorbed criticism with patient grace. Victoria had assumed that was just Michelle's personality, but now she realized it had been survival. They broke her spirit, Victoria said, tears streaming down her face. My own family systematically destroyed a woman who had saved them, and I just stood by and watched. You didn't know, James said gently. But Victoria shook her head. I knew something was wrong. I could see how they treated her, how they spoke to her. But I told myself it was just family dynamics, that Michelle didn't mind, that she understood her place. Victoria's voice cracked. I'm just as guilty as they are. James was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. Victoria, my family has been asking increasingly pointed questions about Michelle's absence from the wedding planning. They're concerned about aligning themselves with a family that would drive away someone they're calling the perfect daughter-in-law. What did you tell them? I told them what your family told me. That Michelle was difficult, that she'd had some kind of breakdown, that she was just being dramatic. James looked ashamed. Now I realize I was helping spread lies about a woman who deserved nothing but respect and gratitude. Victoria stood up and began pacing the room. We have to fix this. I have to apologize to Michelle. Make her understand that not everyone in this family is like my mother and brother. Victoria, James said carefully. I had coffee with Michelle yesterday. Victoria stopped pacing. You what? She asked to meet with me. I thought she was going to try to convince me to call off the wedding, but instead she warned me about your family's patterns. She was trying to protect us from making the same mistakes she did. What did she say? James hesitated, then decided Victoria needed to hear the truth. She said your family doesn't value people, they use them. She said their love comes with conditions, and their acceptance requires conformity. She warned me that marrying into the Handy family meant accepting their right to treat others poorly. The words hit Victoria like physical blows. She said that about me too, didn't she? She said you had the potential to be different, but only if you had a partner strong enough to help you break free from your family's toxic patterns. Victoria sank back down onto the bed, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. James, what if she's right? What if I'm just like them? What if I'll end up treating my future daughter-in-law the way they treated Michelle? Then we make sure you don't, James said firmly. We learn from their mistakes. We choose to be better. Victoria's phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Margaret's name appeared on the screen, and Victoria reluctantly answered. Victoria, darling, I need you to come downstairs immediately. We're having a family meeting about the wedding preparations. Mother, I'm busy right now. This can't wait. The Wellingtons have been asking entirely too many questions about Michelle, and we need to coordinate our responses. It's time to control this narrative before it gets out of hand. Victoria looked at James, then at the evidence of her family's lies scattered across her bed. Actually, Mother, I think it's time for the truth to come out. What are you talking about? I found Michelle's box. I know what she did for this family, and I know how you repaid her kindness. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. Victoria, Margaret said finally, her voice cold with warning, you don't understand the complexities of the situation. That woman manipulated us, made us dependent on her so she could hold it over our heads. The only thing Michelle held over your heads was your own consciences, Victoria replied, surprised by her own strength. And apparently that wasn't enough to make you treat her with basic decency. Young lady, you will not speak to me that way. Come downstairs this instant so we can discuss this properly. Victoria looked at James, who nodded encouragingly. No, Mother. I'm done pretending that this family's behavior is acceptable. And if you can't understand why driving away the best thing that ever happened to us was wrong, then maybe the Wellingtons are right to question whether this wedding should happen at all. She hung up the phone and immediately called her mother-in-law-to-be. Mrs. Wellington? It's Victoria. I think it's time you and I had a very honest conversation about my family and what really happened to Michelle. Chapter 9. The Alliance. Grumbles. The emergency meeting in the Wellington family's stately library felt more like a tribunal than a wedding planning session. Charles Wellington sat behind his mahogany desk, his fingers steepled as he regarded the Handy family with obvious disgust. His wife, Patricia, flanked him on one side, while James stood protectively behind Victoria's chair. The documents from Michelle's box lay spread across the desk like evidence in a court case, which in many ways they were. The library itself seemed to pass judgment on the proceedings. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that spoke of generations of Wellington family wisdom and integrity. Family portraits gazed down from above the fireplace, men and women who had built their fortune on honest business practices and genuine philanthropy. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, giving the room an almost celestial quality that made the Handy family's sins seem even more sordid by comparison. Margaret Handy sat rigidly upright in her chair, her usual commanding presence diminished by the weight of the evidence against her. She kept glancing at the documents spread across Charles's desk as if she could make them disappear through sheer force of will. Her designer suit, which had seemed so powerful and intimidating that morning, now looked like armor that couldn't protect her from the truth. Todd fidgeted beside her, his confidence completely shattered as he stared at proof of his wife's generosity and his family's betrayal. His hands shook slightly as he reached for his water glass, the ice clinking against the crystal in the otherwise silent room. The golden boy, who had always relied on charm and family, connections to smooth over his failures, now looked like what he truly was, a man who had destroyed the best thing in his life through cruelty and arrogance. Only Victoria seemed at peace, having finally chosen honesty over family loyalty. She sat straight-backed in her chair, her hand intertwined with James's, drawing strength from his support. The choice she'd made had cost her dearly. Her mother was barely speaking to her, and her brother alternated between rage and desperate pleas for her to reconsider. But for the first time in her life, Victoria felt like she was living authentically rather than playing a role in her family's endless performance. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," Charles Wellington began, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "You're telling us that Michelle Anna, the woman you described as an unstable servant who had delusions of grandeur, is actually one of the most respected philanthropists in the city?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Charles had spent the morning making phone calls to contacts throughout the city, verifying the information Victoria had brought to them. Every conversation had painted the same picture. Michelle Anna was a woman of substance, intelligence, and genuine compassion, who had mysteriously disappeared from charitable circles after her marriage to Todd Handy. "Mr. Wellington," Margaret began, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone, "you have to understand that Michelle can be very manipulative. She saved those documents to use against us if you ever what?" Patricia Wellington interrupted sharply. "If you ever treated her so badly that she decided to leave?" "Margaret, these aren't manipulative documents. These are thank you letters. In your own handwriting." Patricia's voice carried a cold fury that was somehow more devastating than shouting would have been. As a mother herself, she found the Handy family's treatment of Michelle particularly reprehensible. The idea that a woman could rescue a family from financial and social ruin only to be publicly humiliated for her efforts violated every principle Patricia held dear. She picked up one of Margaret's letters and read aloud, "Dearest Michelle, your generosity has saved our family from complete ruin. I will never forget what you've done for us. We are forever in your debt." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Margaret's face had gone pale, but she continued to try to control the narrative. "That was written during a particularly difficult time. Michelle took advantage of our vulnerability to make herself seem indispensable." "Took advantage?" Charles's voice rose slightly. "Mrs. Handy, according to these financial documents, your daughter-in-law spent nearly $500,000 of her own money to save your family from bankruptcy. She used her connections to get your son's failed business ventures back on track. She quietly managed your social rehabilitation when Todd's gambling debts became public knowledge." Todd had been silent throughout the confrontation, but now he looked up with desperate eyes. "She never told me she was spending her own money." "If I had known." "You would have what?" James asked coldly. "Treated her with respect? Valued her contributions? Or would you have just found more creative ways to humiliate her? Victoria reached for James's hand, drawing strength from his support. James is right. We all knew how Mother and Todd treated Michelle. The money doesn't matter. They would have been cruel to her regardless. Victoria, Margaret snapped. How dare you air our family's private business to outsiders? Outsiders? Victoria's voice carried a strength that surprised everyone, including herself. James is going to be my husband. The Wellingtons are going to be my family. And if I have to choose between protecting your secrets and building an honest marriage, I choose honesty. Charles Wellington nodded approvingly. That's exactly what we hoped to hear, Victoria. But I'm afraid the issue is larger than your individual choice. He stood and walked to the window overlooking the family's pristine gardens. The Wellington name has been built on 3 generations of integrity, philanthropy, and genuine respect for others. We've always been proud of our reputation for treating people, all people, with dignity. He turned back to face the room. What happened at Victoria's engagement party wasn't just a family disagreement. It was a public display of cruelty toward a woman who had literally saved your family. And now we discover that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of systematic mistreatment. Mr. Wellington, Todd said desperately, I know I made mistakes, but Michelle is my wife. I love her. I can fix this if she'll just give me another chance. Love. Patricia Wellington's voice was ice cold. Todd, you stood in front of 50 people and called your wife a servant. You watched her pick up broken glass with her bare hands while you laughed. That's not love, that's abuse. The word struck the room like lightning. Margaret gasped audibly, while Todd recoiled as if he'd been slapped. We don't use that word lightly in our family, Charles continued. But what else would you call the systematic degradation of someone who trusted you with her heart and her fortune? James stepped forward, his face grave. There's something else you need to know. I spoke with Michelle yesterday, and she tried to warn me about this family's patterns. She could have used what she knew to destroy you completely, but instead she tried to protect Victoria and me from making her mistakes. What did she say? Victoria asked quietly. She said that handy family love comes with conditions, that your acceptance requires conformity, that you see people as either useful or disposable. James looked directly at Margaret and Todd. Everything she said has been proven correct by your own documents. Margaret finally exploded. That woman has turned you all against us. Can't you see what she's doing? She's destroyed our family, broken up our son's marriage, and now she's trying to ruin Victoria's wedding. She didn't destroy anything, Victoria said firmly. She just stopped hiding the destruction you caused. And she's not trying to ruin my wedding. She's trying to make sure I don't end up as miserable as she was. Charles returned to his desk and gathered up the documents. I've heard enough. Patricia and I need to discuss what we've learned with our family. What does that mean? Todd asked, panic evident in his voice. It means, Patricia said coolly, that we need to decide whether we're comfortable aligning the Wellington name with a family that treats their own members so poorly. Margaret shot to her feet. You can't be serious. This is one woman's word against ours, one disgruntled ex-daughter-in-law trying to get revenge. Actually, Charles said quietly, it's your own words, your own handwriting, your own documented pattern of behavior. He looked at Victoria with genuine sadness. I'm sorry, my dear, but this isn't just about personal compatibility anymore. This is about fundamental values. Victoria felt tears streaming down her face, but she nodded. I understand. And I'm ashamed that it took all this for me to see what my family really is. The question now, James said, taking Victoria's hand, is whether you're willing to break free from their patterns and build something better with me. Yes, Victoria said without hesitation. Whatever it takes. Charles and Patricia exchanged a meaningful look. In that case, Patricia said slowly, we may be able to move forward, but there will be conditions. Anything, Victoria said. First, there will be a public apology to Michelle. Not a private note or a quiet phone call, a genuine public acknowledgement of how she was treated and what she meant to your family. Margaret's face turned purple. Absolutely not. We will not humiliate ourselves publicly for that ungrateful. Then there will be no wedding, Charles said firmly. Our family will not be associated with people who can't take responsibility for their actions. Second, Patricia continued, Victoria will distance herself from the toxic elements of her family. That doesn't mean cutting off all contact, but it does mean establishing clear boundaries and refusing to enable abusive behavior. Victoria nodded eagerly. Yes, absolutely. And third, Charles finished, we want Michelle at the wedding, as an honored guest, treated with the respect she should have received all along. The room fell silent. Todd looked like he might be sick, while Margaret appeared to be having some kind of breakdown. Those are our terms, Patricia said firmly. Take them or leave them. Victoria looked at her mother and brother, then at James and his parents. The choice had never been clearer. I take them, she said firmly. All of them. Margaret stood up shakily. Then you're no daughter of mine. If that's what it takes to be a decent human being, Victoria replied, then I can live with that. As the Handy family left the Wellington house in disgrace, Victoria felt something she'd never experienced before, the lightness of living authentically. The wedding might still happen, but it would be on terms that honored truth over tradition, integrity over image, and somewhere across town, Michelle Anna was about to receive a phone call that would change everything. Chapter 10, The Engagement That Ended Everything. The Wellington family's garden party was supposed to be a celebration of love and new beginnings, but as Michelle stepped out of her car in front of their elegant estate, she knew she was walking into something far more significant. This wasn't Victoria's original engagement party. That had been destroyed weeks ago in a shower of broken crystal and shattered illusions. This was something entirely different, a public reckoning disguised as a social gathering, orchestrated by the Wellington family to ensure that truth finally prevailed over lies. The Wellington estate was magnificent in the golden afternoon light. Ancient oak trees created natural cathedral arches over meandering pathways, while perfectly manicured gardens displayed the kind of understated elegance that only came from generations of refined taste. White tents had been erected throughout the grounds, their gossamer curtains fluttering in the gentle breeze like whispered secrets. Everything about the setting spoke of old money, genuine class, and the kind of integrity that couldn't be bought or faked. Michelle looked radiant in a flowing emerald dress that complemented her dark skin beautifully. Her hair was styled in an elegant updo, and she wore the diamond earrings her grandmother had left her, not the jewelry Todd had bought to keep her quiet, but pieces that represented her own heritage and strength. She carried herself with the confidence of a woman who had reclaimed her power and was no longer afraid to use it. The dress had been a deliberate choice. Emerald green was the color of new growth, of life triumphing over adversity, of hope emerging from darkness. As she'd stood before her hotel room mirror that morning, Michelle had seen not the broken woman who had fled the Handy mansion, but someone who had been reborn through her own courage and determination. As she walked through the garden gates, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Guests turned to stare, many recognizing her from the society pages where her philanthropic work had been featured prominently over the past month. The whispers began immediately, but they were different from the cruel gossip that had followed her dramatic exit from the Handy mansion. These whispers carried respect, admiration, and more than a little anticipation for what was about to unfold. "Is that Michelle Anna? The woman from the Children's Hospital Foundation? I heard she's raised over $5 million in just 3 weeks. Wasn't she married to the Handys? What's she doing here? Did you see her interview in the Tribune? Absolutely inspiring." Michelle could feel the energy in the garden shift as word of her arrival spread. People began moving closer, drawn by curiosity and the undeniable magnetism of someone who had become a symbol of transformation and resilience. She'd become more than just a person. She was a story, a cautionary tale about the cost of taking someone's loyalty for granted, and the inspiring example of what happened when someone finally chose themselves over the people who diminished them. Charles Wellington spotted Michelle immediately and approached with his wife Patricia at his side. Their faces showed genuine warmth and respect, a stark contrast to how the Handy family had ever treated her. The respect in their eyes wasn't born of fear or social obligation, but of genuine recognition of her worth as a human being. "Miss Anna," Charles said formally, extending his hand. "Thank you so much for coming. I know this can't be easy for you." "Thank you for inviting me," Michelle replied graciously. "Though I have to admit, I'm curious about the nature of this gathering." Victoria's message was rather cryptic. Patricia smiled. "Let's just say that some things needed to be set right before any wedding could take place. Would you like to join us for a moment? There are some people who've been waiting to speak with you." As they walked deeper into the garden, Michelle could see the carefully orchestrated nature of the event. This wasn't a casual party. It was a stage set for public accountability. The city's most influential families were in attendance, along with several prominent members of the charitable community who knew Michelle's work. The guest list had been chosen with surgical precision. Near the center of the garden, beneath a beautiful pergola draped with white roses, Victoria stood with James. She looked nervous but determined, having clearly chosen her path despite the cost. When she saw Michelle approaching, tears immediately sprang to her eyes. "Michelle," Victoria said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so glad you came. There's so much I need to say to you." "Victoria," Michelle replied gently, "you look beautiful and happy. That's all I ever wanted for you." "Before we go any further," Victoria said, her voice growing stronger, "I need everyone here to know the truth about what happened to you, what my family did to you, and what you did for us." A hush fell over the gathered guests as Victoria stepped forward to address the crowd. James stood beside her, his presence clearly giving her strength to do what needed to be done. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria began, her voice carrying clearly through the garden, "many of you were present at my original engagement party, where you witnessed something that should never happen in any family. You saw my sister-in-law, Michelle Anna, humiliated and degraded by the people who should have cherished her most." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. "What you didn't know then, but what I've recently discovered, is that Michelle wasn't just an innocent victim of my family's cruelty. She was the guardian angel who had been saving us from ourselves for years." Victoria pulled out some of the documents from Michelle's box, holding them up for all to see. "Michelle Anna used her own fortune to save my family from bankruptcy. She used her connections to rebuild our reputation when my brother's failures threatened to destroy us. She quietly, selflessly, repeatedly rescued us from the consequences of our own actions." Gasps rippled through the crowd as the magnitude of the revelation sank in. "And how did we repay her kindness?" Victoria's voice cracked with emotion. "We treated her like hired help. We mocked her contributions. We systematically destroyed the spirit of the most generous person any of us had ever known." Michelle watched, stunned, as Victoria publicly dismantled her own family's carefully constructed image. This was more than she had ever expected, more than she had dared to hope for. "The woman you saw picking up broken glass at my engagement party wasn't a servant having a breakdown," Victoria continued. "She was a philanthropist, a community leader, and a genuinely good person who had finally reached her breaking point after years of abuse." From across the garden, Michelle could see Margaret and Todd arriving late, clearly having been reluctant to attend. Their faces showed shock and horror as they realized what was happening. "Victoria, what are you doing?" Margaret called out, pushing through the crowd. "Stop this immediately!" But Victoria didn't stop. If anything, her mother's interruption seemed to strengthen her resolve. "I'm telling the truth, Mother. Something our family seems to have forgotten how to do." She turned back to the crowd. "Michelle Anna deserves more than an apology. She deserves our gratitude, our respect, and our commitment to never again treat anyone the way we treated her." Margaret reached the center of the gathering, her face flushed with rage and embarrassment. "How dare you air our private family business in front of the same people who watched you humiliate Michelle," Victoria interrupted. "The same people who deserve to know the truth about what they witnessed." Todd appeared behind his mother, looking like a man who had aged years in the past few weeks. When he saw Michelle, his face crumpled with something that might have been genuine remorse. "Michelle," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." Michelle looked at her estranged husband for a long moment, seeing not the confident man who had laughed at her humiliation, but a broken person finally confronting the consequences of his actions. "Todd," she said quietly, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent garden, "I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because carrying anger would only hurt me more." She turned to address the entire gathering, her voice strong and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank the Wellington family for giving me this opportunity to speak. What happened at the original engagement party was painful, but it was also liberating. It freed me from a life where I was constantly trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it unconditionally." The crowd listened with rapt attention as Michelle continued. "I've spent the past month remembering who I was before I became someone else's version of what a wife should be. I've returned to the work that gives my life meaning, reconnected with people who value what I contribute, and reclaimed the confidence that was slowly stolen from me." She looked directly at Margaret, who was standing frozen with shock and rage. "Margaret, you were wrong about so many things, but you were right about one. Some people are born to lead, and others are born to follow. You just misjudged which one I was." Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. Michelle turned to Victoria and James, her expression softening. "Victoria, I'm proud of you for choosing truth over convenience, love over fear. James, you're getting a remarkable woman who has learned the difference between loyalty and enabling. I hope you'll both be very happy." "Will you stay for the celebration?" Victoria asked hopefully. "Will you be part of our new beginning?" Michelle smiled, but shook her head gently. "This is your moment, your fresh start. I have my own new beginning to build." As she turned to leave, Todd called out desperately, "Michelle, wait! Can we talk? Can we try to work things out?" Michelle paused and looked back at him with something that might have been pity. "Todd, you can't work out a relationship with someone you never bothered to get to know. You fell in love with an idea of who you wanted me to be, not with who I actually was." She walked through the garden with her head high, past the guests who parted like the sea before her. At the gate, she turned back one final time to address the gathering. "To anyone here who has ever felt diminished, dismissed, or devalued by people who claim to love you, remember that you have the power to walk away. You have the right to demand better, and you are never too small to stand up for yourselves." As Michelle drove away from the Wellington estate, she could see the party continuing in her rearview mirror. But it was no longer about her. It was about Victoria's courage to choose a different path, about the Wellington family's integrity in demanding accountability, and about the power of truth to transform even the most broken situations. Michelle Anna had entered that garden as a woman seeking closure. She left as someone who had finally, completely, magnificently reclaimed her power. The ring she had returned was just a symbol. What she had truly given back to the Handy family was their ability to define her worth. And in doing so, she had set herself free,